Hello everyone, and welcome to the American Civil War Museum's Homefront Education Series as we walk through the war with you. Now, my name is Joseph, and I am joined by Stephanie Arduini, the Deputy Director of the American Civil War Museum, and we have gone through all the significant years of the war, but we still need to talk about its aftermath. So 1865 might have been the final year of armed conflict, but the war isn't exactly over just yet, is it, Stephanie?
No, I think that's a common misconception when we talk about the Civil War. Even though that's the end of armed military engagements, you still have this process of making sense and putting it all together. We knocked down everything by knocking down the institution of slavery, but now we have to figure out what do you do with that? How do you make sense of the death of 750,000 Americans? And if you adjust that for the population of our country today, it would proportionally be about
8 million.
8 million, yeah, 8 million Americans. Thank you, I was blanking on the number.
It's approximately the population of the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Absolutely. And another analogy that we sometimes use, that is basically the same proportion of the population that was killed in the September 11th attacks, but every day for 4 years. So if we're thinking about the weight and the cost of this war, it's incredibly staggering, in addition to the fact that 4 million Americans were now free. But that was it. How do you make sense of that? How do you hold former Confederates accountable if you're the United States so that we can move forward and have a reconciliation, a reunion process, while at the same time making it clear that that can never happen again? How do you balance punishment with progress and healing?
I think the biggest ways of starting this process are through the amendments that are passed. 3 huge amendments get passed and added to the Constitution of the United States as a result of the Civil War. Starting with the 13th Amendment, which abolishes the form of institutionalized race-based slavery. Then moving on to the 14th Amendment, which I think pretty well discusses how you're trying to see that balance between punishment and adding in protections, right? And so, especially because of the 14th Amendment itself, the wording of it is very long and complex, but it does make African Americans official citizens of the United States, as well as adding in some punishment for former Confederates.
Absolutely, because just because the Emancipation Proclamation happened, it wasn't a guarantee that slavery would be forever done. Abraham Lincoln, the lawyer, had started this. If you've seen the movie Lincoln, you get a good illustration of this process. But he wasn't even sure if he had the constitutional authority to do the Emancipation Proclamation, and if it wasn't enshrined in the Constitution, it could be easily overturned with additional legislation. So the 13th Amendment was a way to make permanent the end of slavery, but that's all it did. It didn't explain what was included with freedom, and especially thanks to African American activists and advocates and their allies, they needed definitions of more. They needed to make it clear that they were citizens and guaranteed to all of the rights and protections attributed to citizens. That wasn't always clear and wasn't always being enforced. The other thing that I'll mention is that as part of the official Reconstruction process, this was an initial mess when it came to the Congress. So Andrew Johnson, who was Abraham Lincoln's vice president, he was from Tennessee and had pretty strong white supremacist tendencies and opinions. So when he takes over as the United States president, he is much more forgiving to former Confederates, giving them all sorts of pardons. And people in Congress, especially the radical Republicans in Congress, found this entirely unacceptable, especially at the cost of the civil and human rights of African Americans. So that's where his impeachment comes in, but they also pass additional legislation that requires former Confederate states who are coming back into the Union to write new state constitutions. And in that process, African Americans have to be involved in writing those new state constitutions and being able to vote for those representatives and vote for those. And those states have to ratify the 14th Amendment to the Constitution and eventually the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution.
Right, and that 15th Amendment, the one that gave African American men the right to vote, is another big one and is a great way to note how much African-American power started growing in the United States as well. Here in Virginia, as in fact the first full session of the General Assembly that came into effect after the ratification of the new Virginia State Constitution saw 34 African-American men in that new General Assembly, the highest it's ever been, even today. And so it's fascinating to see how this is, how these people are taking chances and seizing that moment and really getting involved.
Absolutely. We see a lot of African Americans when they get free, during the war and after the war, some of the things that they seek out first, family. Mm-hmm. And there are wonderful digital databases of people placing ads, trying to find family that had been forcibly separated by the institution of slavery. They find education. This has been something that had been legally denied to them, and that they very eagerly were seeking out and trying to find any way to learn and grow. And they sought out participation in civic governance and the civic process. So voting was hugely important, and participating in government by holding elected office was hugely important to African Americans, so that they could have a voice that had been so long denied to them in shaping the communities that they were trying to live.
Right. And of course, what ends up happening is although the period of Reconstruction, both presidential and congressional Reconstruction or radical Reconstruction, they pass, they move on. And it's interesting to note there are some limits to even the Reconstruction amendments. In the 13th Amendment, it does abolish slavery. That institution is formally gone. But involuntary servitude is now something that can be done in a different way. And the prison system becomes a problem. Initially, the 14th Amendment also leaves out, quote, Indians not taxed from being able to recognize their own citizenship, something that wouldn't be fixed or really talked about again until the 1900s. And most notably about the 15th Amendment is that it leaves out women entirely. And so there was still a lot of work that had to be done, even after all of this work had been done following the Civil War. And you can argue that there's still work to be done today, right?
If we talk about Reconstruction, often it comes at the end of a semester in school, right when you're rushing towards the end, or you're picking it up but rushing to get into other things. So we don't often stop and think about how this reimagining of the United States happens after the Civil War. It answers that question of keeping the country together and having a united group of states with a strong federal government. But that ignited all sorts of Americans in imagining what that meant. What did it mean to be a citizen? Who should be able to vote? What was the role of the federal government? Because the Civil War itself had transformed that experience, and people were eager to have these debates. A lot of the limitations that we get out of these three Reconstruction amendments, as they're often called as a package, come from the place of compromise and the limits of where people were in the Civil War. So the 15th Amendment, as you mentioned, it took another 50 years for women to get the right to vote, which is the 19th Amendment. But in that moment, women who'd been actively involved in the abolition movement were also seeking this opportunity to say, okay, if we're talking about who should be able to vote, let's make it universal suffrage and not just for black men. And if you notice in the wording for the 15th Amendment, it also talks about how you can't deny it based on race. What it doesn't do is it allows people to set up other ways to limit access to voting. And this was something that often came from communities in the West and in the North who were trying to limit Irish voting, or Chinese immigrants who were coming in to vote, or Native peoples. So it wasn't great. Thaddeus Stevens also had a great quote of saying, I really don't like the end versions of these amendments, but it's because we're making them as men and not as angels. I'm going to take these advances where we can and keep fighting for more. So I think as we're thinking about these amendments and what they mean to us today, of course there's work to do, and of course we should do that work and not leave them as they are. And these amendments, especially the 14th Amendment, are among the most litigated amendments of the Constitution today when it comes to privacy, and rights of citizenship, and this idea of equal protection under the law. Who is entitled to that equal protection? who is a citizen? Are you a citizen because you're born here? Because that's what the 14th Amendment said, because that's what African Americans were advocating for when they were born here and they personally identified as Americans. So these are resonating with a lot of our conversations today, and I think it's important to understand the origins of these amendments so we can understand the limitations, so that we can find better solutions to fix some of those holes and figure out how we need to imagine these laws applying to ourselves today and for people in the future.
Absolutely. And while we could probably, you and I, stand here for a good hour plus to talk about the other things that happened after or during Reconstruction, including domestic terror, struggle, but also those triumphs of all of those folks, unfortunately for us today, we have to close it up here. So I do want to thank you all for walking through the war with us. Here at the American Civil War Museum, we greatly appreciate your time and attention, and hopefully you'll be able to stop on by sometime soon and walk through the war yourself. Really see what it was like to go through this experience with others and with your family. So we do hope that we get to see you again and see you very soon. But until then, thank you.